Coordinator of New Wineskins. Hello, Derrick.
Hey, Paul.
How you doing?
I'm good.
Good.
I'm a little tired today, but
Yeah,
I'm good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we're here with Martin Luther. Yesterday, what was yesterday, Derrick?
He had a busy day yesterday. It was Reformation Day. So
That's right. So we're joined by Martin Luther. I hope you can see him. He says hello as well. So, Derrick, we're here to talk a bit about the March 16th, 2019 conference, From Isolation to Invitation, a conference on disabilities. And I'm really looking forward to it. There's already been a lot of momentum related to it, people interested. And today I thought we would discuss some newsworthy items earlier this year, namely Pope Francis saying the abortion of a fetus with Down syndrome or with carrying some kind of disability or genetic disorder is similar to Nazi eugenics. And Richard Dawkins, the famed biologist, took major issue with that, and he's been known before in the past to talk about, from his vantage point, the abortion of a fetus with Down syndrome or disability, what have you, more generally, is not about eugenics or meant to harm ultimately. It's to avoid human suffering. So polarizing views on the subject in our society today, to say the least.
Yeah, to be sure.
And what I want to get at with Derrick today is more Richard Dawkins' view about abortion of a fetus with Down syndrome or with carrying disability to avoid human suffering. And really want to get at his whole, what I'm going to call his metaphysic of the selfish gene, emphasis on the genotype. Could you just articulate, Derrick, a bit about Dawkins' emphasis on the genotype being the focal point of reality?
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm not a scientist, and I always like to caveat that. I've read quite a bit of Richard Dawkins because he continues to stay in the news over the last few decades. He wrote, I think one of his more famous books is The Selfish Gene, and in that book that was one of the first books he really wrote that started his anti-religious crusade through the vehicle of science. And what he really wanted to emphasize in that book is, at the end of the day, the core reality of what we as humans are. We aren't these bodies that you see, so to speak, which is, I suppose he loosely refers to them as the phenotype, like how we are expressed as individuals in history. But what we are at our core is just genetic information. And his view of evolutionary theory, which he wants especially to wield against religious types, is very random, very contingent. And at the end of the day, he uses the phrase, we're simply lumbering robots that contain genetic information. And so who we are as individuals are merely vehicles to pass on genetic information. And so the personalities and distinguishing characteristics of the people that you know and that you love, all of those are ultimately disposable and are useful only insofar as they have allowed genetics to perpetuate. And yeah, so he has kind of this almost dualistic view of the human person.
Right, there's the gene, but that gene is ultimately separable. It's separate from everything that we see, so to speak. And relationships are not constitutive of who we are.
Yeah, and in a very strange way, it's sort of Cartesian dualism in a new key, I think.
Right, that's a good way of putting it. Contrast that perspective, Derrick, with his colleague at Oxford, Dennis Noble, in his book, The Music of Life, because he wants to emphasize not going from the bottom up, so to speak, right, but from the top down.
Top down, yeah. Yeah, I think, and I find this fascinating just from a scientific and theological...
And he's a systems biologist.
He's a systems biologist, and what that means is that he really focuses on, his expertise is the heart. And so systems biology, as I understand it, again, I'm not a scientist, this is...
nor was he.
Yeah, nor was Martin Luther. Systems biology focuses on the interactions and feedback within a holistic system. So instead of it being purely top-down or purely bottom-up, there's a sort of complex web of interactions. And what Dennis Noble, who himself, he's not a Christian, he's actually friends with Richard Dawkins, but he really disagrees with a lot of Dawkins' characteristics. And despite Dawkins' popularity persisting even today, Dawkins isn't really representative of a lot of evolutionary or biological theory. And one of the ways that Dennis Noble wants to point that out is he says that while Dawkins will sort of sheepishly insist that his metaphor that we're just lumbering robots with genetic information is just a metaphor in order to help explain difficult scientific concepts, Noble wants to emphasize that actually our metaphors do a lot of heavy conceptual lifting. And one of the problems with Dawkins' metaphor is that it actually really begins to shape not only what we do see, but what is possible for us to see. And Noble wants to emphasize that actually one can reverse Dawkins' metaphor without loss and perhaps even with some gain. And so instead of lumbering robots that are simply vehicles that are like disposable shells once the genetic information has been passed on, Noble wants to emphasize, as a systems biologist and as someone who wants to look at holistic feedback systems, that actually our genetic information is trapped in us as individuals who are expressing it. Mm-hmm. So that he really wants to regain the priority of individuals and human societies and interactions that are often just purely invisible to what are sometimes termed ultra-Darwinians, who see no people per se, and some, like Dennett, push this as far as to say that even human self-consciousness isn't real. It's simply an illusion, again, designed as a vehicle to perpetuate genetic information. And Dennis Noble says, look, that metaphor, it can be flipped on its head. It's doing too much explanatory power for Dawkins and others like Dennett. And in fact, when we do flip it and say that the human at the level of the individual is important, a whole new world of actually scientific explanation, let alone moral and ethical and theological explanation, becomes available to us.
And we'll focus on the moral dimension here shortly. But further to what you had said about Noble, I think he talks about, instead of this idea that we are genes that are trapped in these lumbering robots, actually for Noble, we are intelligent, highly intelligent beings that imprison these genes.
Yes,
so he's turning it around.
Exactly,
so
yeah.
And he's really accounting for, I think, as you were saying, who we are at the macro level, and including in society, our relationships and the like.
Yeah.
And what difference might that make, even for matters of how we relate to others?
Yeah.
We cannot look at one another simply as genetic, atomistic parts. We have to look at ourselves in relationship to others, that we are who we are in relation. Certainly our genes matter, but they are part of a macrocosm, so to speak, that must account for who we are in relationship. And so on the theological level, you and I were talking earlier, it almost reminds me as if Dawkins is like a biological or genetic modalist. What's a modalist, Derek?
You go pop quiz.
He would know.
Yeah.
He would know.
Modalism is a term in theology that's often comes up in Trinitarian theology. And so in modalism, instead of seeing the three persons of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as distinct identities, they're actually just manifestations, usually in history, manifestations of a single, undifferentiated, underlying reality. So when we see Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, we're not really seeing God per se. We're seeing masks that he assumes at any given time.
Yeah.
That's so, a nutshell.
Yeah, so like Freud was perhaps a biological Calvinist. Dawkins is more or less a kind of genetic or biological modalist.
Yeah.
And so, in other words, who we are in relationship, or our persons, Father, Son, and Spirit on the divine level, or who we are as persons on the human level, are really epiphenomenal or secondary or not constitutive of what we really are. What we really are these genes that are trapped, so to speak.
Right.
And so what might that mean? Back to our conference, March 16th, 2019, From Isolation to Invitation, a conference on disabilities. We are who we are in relation. And of course, there are many different kinds of intelligence too. It's not just an analytical intelligence. There can be musical intelligence. There can be emotional, cultural, social intelligence. And individuals with Down syndrome, often I find them to be quite happy individuals. Their quality of life often seems to be much higher than our own.
Yeah.
What they bring to a community often far outweighs what you and I might bring to the community, even what he brought to the community, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Because they don't even take for granted, as one professor at OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University, said to me, is they often feel that their quality of life is better than ours because they don't take for granted things that we often take for granted.
Yeah.
And so, they bring so much to us, and they're often happy in the relationships that they have and that we have with them. And so this has huge bearing. Dawkins' view, Noble's view, from the kind of selfish gene approach with Dawkins, his metaphor, which isn't ultimately fact. It's a metaphor that shapes a system for what we would call theology, what he might call metaphysics, and so too does Noble's. And I tend to like Noble's view much more, and he's not even a believer, right? I mean, he's not
No, he's not. In fact, he's an atheist.
Yeah, he's an atheist, but I appreciate what he's doing on the more metaphorical, metaphysical level, because metaphors do matter.
Yeah,
they do bear upon how we relate to one another. They do bear upon matters of morality. And so we'll just talk a few more minutes about this, but let's focus in on both the conference from isolation to invitation, and then even how we relate to people more generally, that we don't look at people as simply carriers of good genes or bad genes, that we see one another as far more complex in our life and in our relationships in society. So, Derrick, on that point of just the matter of genetic makeup and social relations, could you speak to the matter of how this might bear from your vantage point on the conference theme, from isolation to invitation? If we look at people as more than just 23andMe or DNA or genetics, what might that mean for us, both in the conference and in society as a whole?
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge question.
Well, it's either asking you or him. And
I wish Martin Luther was here. That'd be fascinating. I guess one answer is that in many ways, despite the relatively up-to-date information, I mean, Dawkins was really writing a lot of this in the 70s, but hasn't really gone back on his positions as far as I know, even though, again, he's not really representative of biological theory at large anymore. He really was in the 70s. But there's kind of been an age-old distinction that has played not just put antagonism between religion and science, but it has really put antagonism between the humanities and science, and that's really what's sometimes referred to as the difference between primary and secondary qualities. And as far as I know, I think Galileo actually originated this distinction, or put it into play in a new way. And the basic difference, again, is kind of going back to what Dawkins wants to differentiate. So primary qualities are, hopefully I'm not reversing these here, but primary qualities are things like extension. They're things like physicality. They're essentially like the substrates of primary substances. Secondary substances are things like color. They're things that often need a perceiving agent to exist. And this distinction has been employed in a variety of different ways, but it often plays into a certain scientism in our culture. So we're not anti-science here at all, but science really, the reason it's so brilliant, the reason it explains so many things is precisely because it can narrow down the questions it's trying to answer. But with Dawkins with Daniel Dennett in particular, he talks about Darwinism as a universal asset. It can fundamentally explain everything about humanity. Now, that may or may not be true, but it's certainly not true in the way that Dennett means it, because everything that we really value as humans is sort of paired off in order to then be able to be explained by science. And just to refer to self-consciousness again, Dennett wrote a huge, sprawling book called Consciousness Explained, but he actually never really explains consciousness, because his whole book is based on the premise that consciousness, self-consciousness, doesn't exist. It's an illusion created by a bunch of other mechanisms that create the illusion of us, which is a helpful illusion in order to, again, to perpetuate genetic information. So to your question about the conference, when our metaphors and our metaphysics, our theologies, they really help us how we shape and see the world. And if we see people just as genetic information, then the ethical character of any given individual, their levels of happiness, their interactions with the community, their personal opinions about if they have Down syndrome, are they, if they're happy, none of those things really matter in this way of viewing things. And then I think I don't want to accuse Dawkins of bad faith. I think he genuinely thinks that he's trying to reduce suffering, but I think many of us would be very struck by the sort of cold utilitarian calculus that he is using in order to come to his decision about what pain is, about what a better existence is.
Yeah, and it's very atomistic, individual suffering, and again, according to how he defines it, in terms of a certain kind of intelligence.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that certain kind of intelligence, which, by the way, he has, then your life will not be as meaningful. And I'm really thankful that our biblical faith does not frame things along those lines.
Yeah.
It's often not the wise, by the way of how the world looks at things. It's not often the strong that God calls. Paul talks about this in 1 Corinthians 1. God calls the wise in terms of the foolishness of Christ. God calls the strong in terms of the weakness of Christ.
Yeah.
This is what the biblical tradition reveals. And so when we see God revealed in Jesus and the Spirit, these are not just secondary qualities. This is how God engages. And I'm so thankful that what we see in Jesus is what we get with God. It's not some kind of mode that can be explained away like a mask. And we just celebrated Halloween yesterday. At least you and I did. But the idea is that Jesus isn't wearing some mask, that ultimately there's this divine gene behind it all. No, what we see in Jesus is really what we get with God. And that's going to be bearing upon our conference because Jesus doesn't engage people who have less than a certain kind of intelligence, less humanly. He engages them in the fullness of relationship. Let the little children come unto me. Let others come unto me. And so we want to move from isolation to invitation and to take really seriously this idea that we are who we are. Yes, with our genes. Yes, with God, with the divine essence. But ultimately, that essence is truly revealed through the Father, Son, and Spirit. They are each God, and we are all human, not simply in our human essence or our genetic makeup, good and bad genes alike, but who we are in the quality of our relationships and that kind of qualitative happiness in relationship to others, not just individually, but collectively, is so important. And it does bear upon the theme of this subject matter of disabilities and how do we move from isolation to invitation to include others, because I just know our churches and our communities would be much more enriched if we took seriously how we can be really enhanced in community by way of engaging people with disabilities or alternative abilities so that we might flourish together. And so I hope you'll join us March 16th, 2019 for our conference, From Isolation to Invitation, a conference on disabilities. This is Derrick Peterson, New I Nuance.